Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Old Hunt, where we are still celebrating 10 years of Bloodborne. We are playing through version 1.00 of the Japanese release, and last time we were in the middle of exploring a set of secret passages hidden in Mergo's loft. Right? It all sort of started from this one cage that wouldn't quite close around us that allowed us to roll off at just the right time, eventually, into a hidden passage, make our way past a bunch of winter lanterns, and eventually we worked our way up to this lever over here, which then dropped some giant weird frenzy thing out of this tower down into some other undetermined location. So we were beginning to make some progress back, having fought our way through the worst of it, and then, it had been quite enough time, so we sort of left things unfinished. We're going to pick that up today, but of course, before we get there, I do want to address some of the comments that people were making in the previous episode. So I just want to start off with a couple points from Martin Seghetti here. So first of all, Martin Seghetti was noticing that the keepers of the old lords, the people in the chalice dungeons who wear this sort of getup here, are interestingly modeled sort of after hunters, because this makes more sense if you've seen a little bit more of the chalice dungeons than I think I've shown on screen in this playthrough. But the keeper enemies, because they're both bosses and wandering enemies and humanoids, they're particularly prone to this sort of categorization. And not only that, but they fight with a sword in one hand and a sort of pyromancy in the other, kind of like we fight with a melee weapon in one hand and a firearm in the other, right? It's sort of projectile defense. And then, of course, if you have an arcane build going on, you can bolster your own damage with some sort of fire or magical spells or something, right? So there's a little bit of a similarity there. And notably, this is something of a mechanical observation. When you defeat hunters at various points in the game, their gear tends to become available in the hunter's dream if you go to the Insight Messenger Bath. And just like all those hunters that we defeat and we can get their gear, this gear also shows up at the Insight Messenger Bath in the hunter's dream. So this all, you can sort of take it together and maybe categorize these keepers, these oldest of the guardians of the Great Ones, as a type of hunter, right? So all the way back to the earliest origins of the Chalice Dungeons, maybe we have hunters who are stalking the place, and they have something to do with a sin that they may have committed. That's also potentially relevant, although the clearest tie that you can see with sin and the hunters is something that comes up in the DLC, which, again, not exactly covering in the Old Hunt, but I do think it's another interesting point of similarity, come to think of it. And then there's one more thing that Martin Seghetti pointed out in this vein. There's one, completely unrelated thing. But in this vein, Martin Seghetti also pointed out that the Chalice Dungeons, and I did call this out when I put some of them on screen in this Old Hunt playthrough way back towards the beginning when I was going through the first of the Tumaru Chalices, you can find engravings of the Hunter's Mark in the walls of the chalices. Right? So this goes along with this idea of the keepers of the old lords maybe being the very first versions of hunters. Who knows, right? The chalices go back to time out of mind, so difficult to say. Interesting if that's the case, but, I don't think we're necessarily ever going to get anything like in terms of hard evidence to talk about that, but there's a lot of things that you can tie together in what I think is a fascinating way. So I wanted to make sure to address that. The other thing that Martin Seghetti brought up that wasn't necessarily related to the Keepers of the Old Lords is that those spider enemies that I was talking about, apparently they're called Nightmare Apostles, and that is the same no matter what sort of variant they are. So I was saying at some point in the last episode that they may be less intelligent than Patches the Spider. It's also just possible that they have intelligence, but they're just hostile and not interested in dealing with us the way that Patches was. And even Patches, right, he was using his intelligence in something of a hostile way, something of a selfish, hostile way. But, that's also just Patches. So a little difficult to, ride that particular line. I also got an interesting comment from Blitzcott, but for once, I can't really address it at the start of the episode because it involves some visual information. And, I feel like every time this comes up, I have to give this caveat, but visual information is not my forte. But even so, I want to do some examination of the textures of the door in the doors, I suppose, in the Hunter's Nightmare and then the Abandoned Old Workshop, because I think that could be potentially interesting based off of this comment that I got. So I'm thinking maybe we'll get to that at the end of the episode. For starters, there's a particular key that I want to read because it's about to become relevant, and I don't want to forget about it, right? This is the iron door key, and that's a very straightforward translation, right? The first kanji means iron, the second one means door, and then we have of, which is, no, and then we have key. That's the last kanji there. So it's the key of the iron door, it's the iron door key. Very straightforward item name. Let's take a look at the description. Okay, so the first two lines sort of run together, and this is a little bit of a confusing amount of information to convey in words, but I'm going to do my best here. Key that opens the iron door that leads to the middle of the three large bridges that connect the church of the two hanging cages. Okay, I think that's all the information. It's phrased in a particularly obtuse way in the Japanese, and then even when you try and put it together, it's not entirely clear. But the idea seems to be tied to the unique construction of the man-made portions of the Hunter's Nightmare. I would call the whole thing Mergo's Loft, but it's not entirely clear to me exactly what that term encompasses. It could simply refer to the primary tower that leads to Mergo, whereas this description is focused specifically on the three large bridges that join the two castle-like structures together. Thinking back, it seems like the first of these three bridges would be the one where we can fight Choir Intelligence or Edgar. The second is the one we're on right now, and the third and highest one is where we crossed over after accessing the secret passage off the elevator. But it's interesting that they specify like the cathedral, which I guess it's considered a not necessarily a cathedral, a church, right? So daiseido, or like dai means like big, sei means holy, and then do is like a hall, right? So the daiseido is the cathedral, the big holy hall. This is just a regular holy hall. It's not big enough to be a cathedral, even though it's pretty darn big if you ask me. You consider the entirety of the, structure that is Mergo's Loft. But it doesn't merit, that initial kanji that means big, I guess. I didn't write this description. But it's an interesting way to, frame that building as being the, holy hall, literally, of the two hanging cages, because it has that, midpoint where you could go up to the highest level and down to the lowest level, right? That's how our shortcut works. But I think that's just an interesting function of how the Japanese has to convey in words the construction of this elaborate, dual set of, castle tower places. Anyway, those are the first two lines, very descriptive. So let's just move on to the next section here. There's no way that there could be a thief in this nightmare world, or in the nightmare world, a nightmare world. Again, it's not specified in the Japanese. But the idea is there's not going to be any thievery in the Nightmare of Mensis, right? That's the very first line, simple idea that's then going to get built on by the next one, because it opens with sore demo, which is even so, right? So even though it's basically unthinkable that there would be a burglar in this nightmare world, there must be some reason to have a key to lock this door, right? And I'm making it more suggestive than it necessarily needs to be in Japanese by saying there must be a reason, but you could also render that even though there's no way there'd be a thief in this nightmare, there apparently is a reason that makes it worth it to have this method of locking the door, right? So it's not necessarily putting in that element of speculation, but I think it sort of makes sense to be a little bit presumptive about that, just because it involves sort of stepping into the minds of the people who put this place together. Anyway, very final line here. Perhaps it should not be approached. Okay, right? So there's some more potential information there, right? Where it's saying, maybe there's a reason there's this locked door, even though there's no need to worry about thieves, right? I guess it wasn't necessarily putting itself in the mind of Mensis. It was just putting itself in a form of a warning. And because we sort of came at this backwards, I don't think this necessarily makes a lot of sense. So I'm just going to very quickly run forwards. I'm going to ignore all these items. Sort of pains me to do so. I'm going to come back later and pick them all up. And I'm 100% sure I'm going to do that. So don't mind rushing over here right now. And if we come all the way over here, we will find that the key opens this particular door. Right? So that was opened by the iron door key. And if we had come at this from the other direction, right? If we had, come into wherever this place is and used the iron door key to unlock this door and then strolled out past these statues over this way, right? We would have found ourselves confronted with these people with these frenzy spears sticking out of them, even though they're corpses, and picked up their madman's knowledge. And we would have noticed the giant frenzy thing that would still be there because, we wouldn't have pulled the lever already at that point. And the thing that causes that frenzy buildup would still be there, right? So you have the key that's telling you, look, you can open this door with this key, but maybe you don't want to. And you come out here and you see these things that have died to frenzy. And then if you're foolish enough to just keep coming up this way, you're probably going to die instantly to frenzy. Not from any winter lantern or anything you can do anything about, really, but to that giant, thing in the tower. So that feels pretty significant as a warning, right? But of course, like I said, we came at it from the other direction, having already dealt with the source of the frenzy. So now we don't have to worry. And of course, right, it's interesting to note, right? The one that died over here gives you Madman's knowledge. The ones that made it closer give you Great One's wisdom. That's interesting. Yep, there's another one. This is going to be, indeed, yet another. I bet all of these corpses here are going to be Great One's wisdoms. Nope, that is an arcane gem of some type. But even though, even then, right, what was that? I'm pretty sure that was a droplet shape in terms of the gem shape. And a fairly high-level gem, right? So a fairly high-level droplet gem, that's a pretty rare find, right? So you have this idea of increasing knowledge, increasing value of, rare find once you approach this site where that thing was being held. Something that it caused the mind to almost revolt as soon as you looked upon it. Caused your madness to creep up on you that might eventually culminate in a burst of frenzy, in a burst of madness that will eventually kill you, and in doing so, potentially leave your mind rich with information to be mined for posterity. I've lost the ability to speak as I keep playing. The information in my mind is too great. And then, of course, this looks pretty risky, but it's actually, as long as you don't fall all the way into that hole there that we dropped the thing down into, it's pretty safe. And, of course, it's all lined with eyes, right? Which feels significant because we were looking across at a giant eyeball, but still, seeing all these eyeballs here, it's like it encourages, right? Proximity to that thing seems to have encouraged the growth of eyes, and maybe we can even associate that with eyes on the inside, right? Because we have all that, Great One's knowledge, or Great One's wisdom, Madman's knowledge in the approach, right? Maybe we can associate that wisdom from those corpses as being associated with eyes forming on the inside of their brains, just like we have regular eyes forming on these walls. Interesting to think about. Haven't really thought about that before, but it's potentially an explanation for what's going on there. And then also, I've left this prompt up on the screen because it's worth noting that this is a blood boulder, right? The blood rock is the official translation. Either way, it makes a ton of sense. And this description, I believe, is fairly straightforward. The most important thing about it is purely mechanical, which is that it allows you to upgrade a weapon to +10, which is it's the highest level in Bloodborne. Right, so we have the Bloodstone chunk, and if you look, right, in the Japanese here, all the way from the beginning, only right, the first part that talks about, right, this is a fragment, and then this is a lump, and then this is a giant lump, right, in that first line. That's the only bit of that first line that changes, right? So from shard to chunk to a giant chunk, essentially. And then the final two lines, right, the very first two of these, the shards and the twin shards, exactly the same. This one has a slight variation in the first line, and then the two final lines are different. This one has a slight variation in the first line, and the two final lines are different again, right? So, let's just remind ourselves of what that first line is. This is a gigantic chunk of a solid substance that forms in cold blood, in death blood, right? Literally. And then, of course, it goes on to talk about how the definition of the bloodstone is what doesn't crystallize, right? It congeals out of the blood, but it doesn't crystallize from that substance. And then the final section here, which is going to be unique to the blood rock, which goes with the idea of even so, right? So you get the idea from the juxtaposition between blood rocks and blood stones and blood gems, that the blood gems are the rarer, more desirable things. So this is opening right away with a contrast to that idea by saying that even so, a lump of this size, which is almost like a boulder, is something that's rarely found in the history of all hunters, to the extent that it can only be counted a number of times, right? It's a little bit literal and clunky as far as the translation goes, but right, the idea is, again, it's a slight juxtaposition with the blood gems and saying, so maybe the bloodstones in and of themselves aren't especially valuable, but one that's this big, one that's almost a boulder in size that you can get out of cold blood, you can count on one hand the number of times something like this has been discovered in the history of all hunters, right? So that makes a lot of sense in terms of the rarity thing, and it also makes even more sense than ever in version 1.00. This is something that they kept having to address when it came to like mechanically balancing the game, right? So when Bloodborne 1.00 first came out, like this is pretty much the only blood rock that I can get. Only one weapon is going to get to plus 10. It's probably going to be the saw spear. Because I'm not going to use the rifle spear, and I don't think I'm going to get enough chunks to upgrade another weapon. And as a result, it sort of feels like almost a waste, right? Because let me go back and look at my weapons, right? You can see I've got the saw spear at plus 9. I've got the saw cleaver at plus 3. I got the hunter axe at plus 3. I didn't take the, threaded cane very far. I took the Kirkhammer to plus 3. I got Ludwig's Holy Blade to plus 6. We have the Rider Palash unupgraded completely because I can't really use it. We got the Rifle Spear up to plus 9. So we have 2 things at plus 9, several things at plus 2 or 3. And then, what is this? 2, 3, 4... we're back to the top again, right? At a plus 3. So 5 weapons, I think I got to plus 6. That's a good amount of experimentation that you can do. But then things start to get tight once you need to upgrade to plus 7 and higher, right? Because I could only just barely afford to get 2 things to plus 9. I could maybe get 1 more to plus 9 if I wanted to farm for bloodstone chunks. I don't particularly want to do that, but I could. But even then, if I want to go to plus 10, it's 1. Pick the best of those options, and that's it, right? So it's sort of the way that it's put together encourages you to experiment, at least at the beginning, right? They give you a lot of leeway, and I think I talked about this in the playthrough before, right? If people complain, even now, about the inability to change weapons. I feel like at the early part of the game, you can change weapons very readily. It's just that after you've had time to experiment with all of them, up to the plus 3, plus 6 breakpoints, you need to narrow it down to your favorite 2, and then ultimately your favorite 1. And that is a little bit of a hard pill to swallow, especially because, ideally, you've got 4 slots, right? You've got slots for 2 right-handed weapons and 2 left-handed weapons, and you would want all of them, ideally, to be at the maximum level. So people very quickly got frustrated with the intense rarity of the blood rocks. And so one of the things that the developers did to offset this is in one of the updates, they allowed you to purchase blood chunks and then eventually blood rocks with insight, right? So all of a sudden you could have a little bit more flexibility in what you got to +9. And then out of that, you could probably afford to pick 2 things, right? Because the blood rock cost in terms of insight is 60. And I mean, that's not nothing, right? I'm at 39 right now, but that's because I spent a bunch of my insight that I gained running around through the game buying blue elixirs so that I could do some farming, right? Earlier in this playthrough, I'm pretty sure I was over 60. So if you just don't use insight and play the game, you will naturally accumulate 60 insight. And even if you are using insight, let's just take a look at the options I have here, right? Each madman's knowledge is 1, so that's 56 insight I have sitting here completely unused. And each great one's wisdom is 2, right? So that's 14 more, right? So that's 70 insight that I'm sitting on right here. And then if you use the 3rd umbilical cords, which I don't think I'm going to do in this playthrough at all, but you could, right? That's 3 for each of these, so there's 6 more, right? So just in terms of the insight that I haven't even used on these items, I could buy 1 blood rock. But you're not going to buy a whole bunch of them, right? 60 is enough that it's achievable once, maybe twice in a playthrough, but you're not going to get 5 different blood rocks from the insight shop in one playthrough. Maybe if you do a bunch, but not in one. And so I think part of the idea, to be fair to Bloodborne, was they wanted to encourage chalice exploration. And you could get blood rocks in chalice dungeons, especially after there was another update to the chalice dungeons that changed it so you got much more likely to get those bloodstone chunk and blood rock drops. I think blood rocks have to come from bosses. I'm not very tuned into the particulars because I haven't done a lot of chalice exploration myself. I've done a lot of the story chalices. I've been through them several times now, but I haven't done a lot of exploration outside of them, and that's where you really need to go if you want to start finding blood rocks. I think maybe actually you can find some of them in treasure chests, right? So this is a way of pushing you towards the chalice dungeons. The game has a number of ways of doing it, and that is one of them. So I think probably the idea was go explore the chalices and you'll get at least 1 blood rock, if not more. And then you won't have as much of a problem, particularly after they gave that update. But even then, maybe you want to buy 1 or 2 with insight. And then they also eventually would put 1 in the DLC, right? So the way that I tend to play through the game, I do the story chalices, so I don't really get a blood rock from them. But if you maybe think that you're going to do enough chalice explorations, especially off of 1.00, when you can make chalice dungeons, root chalices offline, which I can't do right now. So even if I wanted to explore non-story chalices, I can't in 1.00 as of right now. Back in the day, you could, and if you have 1.09, you can, right? So imagine you get 1 chalice or 1 blood rock from the chalices. You get 1 blood rock from the main story playthrough. You get 1 blood rock from the DLC, and you get 1 blood rock by saving up some insight. Well, that's all 4 slots, right? That'll fill up each one of these weapons. And you don't even really need to do that, right? I don't feel the pain of not finding blood rocks in the chalices because what am I going to get, a torch to +10? That's going to do nothing for me. I don't have 2 firearms that I like to use. So I feel like you only really need 1 to be good with a weapon. I like to have 2. I think that's an improvement for sure. I think 3 is a really nice place to be at. And then of course, every time you go through another cycle of the game, you can get another 1 at the very least from the base game and 1 at the very least from the DLC, right? So you can continue to get more and more if you keep playing and you keep switching out what weapons you're using. So there is room, and of course you can keep exploring the chalices, there is room for you to expand the number of weapons that you get to +10. Might be difficult if you want to actually max out every last weapon, but still, I feel like over time, this is an issue the developers have been able to address in what I'd say is a thoughtful way. And I do think it's a little bit of a problem in version 1.00 here that I only have 1 readily available blood rock. Right? I can't go to the insight shop and buy another one. There is no DLC for me to play. I can't go outside the story dungeons in 1.00 in the modern day. So I'm stuck with 1 in this playthrough, right? I could go through a New Game Plus cycle, but that's a long time to wait with only 1 weapon at +10. So that's sort of a very mechanical aside, but it ties in with the idea of the blood rocks being extremely rare, right? So I'm showing, I suppose, both with this and the Iron Door Key, the ways in which the game, as much as it uses its item descriptions to talk about lore, it also conveys some important mechanical information. All right, I'm not going to fall down here, and I don't know if there's a way to really readily get back up out of this situation, besides using a bold hunter's mark. So that's what I'm going to use. I think that's probably really the only logical solution. So hopefully you've gotten one of those by this point in the game. You probably have. Anyway, I'm just going to use one. I'll see you again soon. Okay. Here we are. We're back at the base of Marigo's loft. I warped back to the dream, right? Because the bold hunter's mark actually brought me to the lantern associated with Mikolash. I warped back down here because we're going to follow the path of that long descent of that thing that was in the tower. So, let's see. I don't need the one remaining sedative anymore. I want to find the monocular because I'm going to be doing some visual information hunting. And we're going to track down the path that thing fell down. And this is a little bit obscure. I mean, it didn't stop people from finding it pretty quickly, so not that obscure. I probably would have missed this on a... I say probably. I definitely missed this on my first playthrough. By my second playthrough, I had started looking information up on the internet, and I knew all about it, but definitely something... All right. I wasn't going to deal with these things, but I'll deal with them. I do bolt damage, so I go right through their defenses. It's very handy. But after you pull that lever, all of a sudden... Right, uh-oh. It's gonna knock me over. Guy, gal thing? I don't know. Anyway, after you pull that lever, all of a sudden, this cage, which didn't really do anything before, is here and has this switch. Might not even have been here before, come to think of it. I didn't check. If it was here, it couldn't do anything before. If it's not, or if it wasn't here before, then all of a sudden, here it is, right? And now we can gain access to a new part of the Nightmare of Mensis, very secretive, that we never could before. Is the door going to open? Oh, there it is. Okay, that took a while. All right. And here we are in, like, an abyss. And you can, like, just barely make out the outline of this thing over here. Right? And so I'm slowly going to approach. Not so slowly. Here we go. And here we can see it. This here is the brain of Mensis. And we'll get an item that confirms that pretty soon. But as you can see, it really sort of does resemble a disembodied brain. But the thing that's interesting about it, among other things, this is the wrong way to do it. Here we go, monocular. Let's see if I can find a good way to show this. Is the stuff that makes it up is actually... can you see them? Yeah, I think you kind of can, right? It's a bunch of messengers, actually, that are, like, incorporated into its flesh. You can see, sort of by the eyeball that's, like, just under the brim of my hat, to the left of it, you can sort of see the emaciated figure of the back of a messenger. And it's got its, like, shoulders out. It's got one arm sort of pointed down, slanting towards that eye. It's got its head almost like half turned. You can almost make out one of the eyes into the open mouth, right? So, and that's obviously not alone, right? Once you realize that, you can see the identifiable, almost human sort of twisted shapes of the messengers in various positions throughout this thing's tissue mass. And that is going to be a potentially relevant detail when it comes to figuring out what exactly this thing might be. But anyway, now that we've got it down here, it's notably not causing us any frenzy. And that might be because, we're in an inky abyss and it doesn't have a good line of sight. I don't really think that's the case. It might be because it's, like, stunned. Might be because it no longer feels like it was like trapped up in that tower, or maybe it's separated from the mind of Mensis. It's not entirely clear why all of a sudden we're not instantly dying to frenzy and getting eyes implanted in our brains, maybe, and, having to deal with that set of issues. But we're not, so that's fortunate. And let's see if I was not forward thinking. That's fine. Let's reassign a gesture. Because if we take a page out of the choir's book, we can make contact with this thing. Let me just... Okay. How do I confirm this? There we go. Okay. So I'm now going to make the make contact gesture. You can't just make this gesture. You have to wait a while. I'll save you that time. So I'm going to skip forward until when this gesture matters. There it is. Eventually, if you maintain this gesture long enough, you will get the moon rune. And I believe this is the highest level of the moon rune. And it's not entirely clear why this happens. Clearly, you're able to send out some sort of signal and then receive one in return, right? That's sort of how the idea of make contact works in general. But why exactly is it moon? We do know that the runes are associated with visual representations of the voices of great ones. And so it's possible that the brain of Mensis looks at us, receives our signal, and then recognizes the moon presence having an effect on us and says, oh, moon, right? Something to that effect. I think maybe that was last protagonist who gave me that idea. I can't remember. It's been a long time. I know he had a video in which he outlined an interesting theory about the moon presence. I'll link that below for sure. Not the moon presence, the brain of Mensis. I'll link that for sure. But wherever the idea came from, I do think it makes some sense that this thing could be lying here, receives a communication from us, and recognizes, oh, hey, I recognize the moon, maybe the scent of the moon. I'm just, going for an edge case there of my pet theory. But that is the very secretive way in which you can obtain, I believe it's the highest level of the moon rune. Let's take a look at that real quick. Yeah, if there's a higher level, I don't know what it is. Interestingly, I forgot about this. The second level, right? So the weakest of the moon runes is this one that we get from, I believe it's the Yahar Ghul. So you get it the first time you go, or you can get it the first time you go there if you get kidnapped. If you never get kidnapped, you have to wait. But it's interesting because they're all sort of associated with Yahar Ghul, right? And they're the ones who are performing a ritual to call the moon. So we have, this one that we find in the Unseen Village. We have this one that we find in the library that I forgot about, all the way at the bottom of that staircase that I thought might have been the key, when in fact the key comes from the boss arena, and then the second level of the moon rune comes from there. And then the strongest, the highest level, actually I see that light in the center. I'm almost certain that's the highest level of the moon rune because the highest level runes have that light in the center. Anyway, this is directly from the brain of Mensis, but it's the brain of Mensis, and it's also in the nightmare of Mensis. So, interesting association there. And I mean, like I said, it sort of makes sense. School of Mensis is attempting to call the red moon. Moon is on their brains, right? But I haven't really put through that physical connection between all of the places associated with Mensis and the places you get the moon runes before. That's very interesting to me. Not necessarily sure where I want to take that, but interesting to think about. Also, let's see. Okay, oh, right. I was thinking there was another item to show you. I haven't gotten it yet, because in order to get it, we have to do something very mean. This thing was nice enough to communicate, right? We reached out to it. It communicated back to us. That's more than the choir got with their call beyond. They just called out into a dark patch of space and got nothing. This thing responded to us. We're gonna kill it. Okay, this might take a while. I'm gonna cut forward again. Okay, I've almost got it. I just think this is interesting. My very weak rifle spear here is actually doing more damage. I don't know if it'll live. Than a full set of attacks from my bolt-based saw spear. So it must have some pretty strong bolt resist. Anyway, we got the item I was looking for. This is the living string. And this is another very important item, and we're going to look at it right now. This is also the item that I need to get back to, hopefully, maybe, I don't know, I don't have a lot of time right now, but maybe do the chalice explorations. And I don't know why I'm looking at her runes, probably because I was just talking about one. But we're actually looking for chalice materials. It's got to be here somewhere. Oh, it's not. I was thinking it would be at the bottom, but we get the special right materials, and that changes things. Anyway. Here we have the living string, and again, title, very straightforward. Ikiteiru is still alive, right? In the ongoing present of living, right? That's the, conjugated form of ikiru that ikiteiru is. And then himo is katakana for string. So interestingly, it's not specifying a kanji, right? It's just specifying the sound for himo, which might suggest that there's something more to it than just a regular string. It's just maybe sort of a superficial resemblance. Interesting little subtlety of the, nature of the way the Japanese is representing the sounds with the phonetic representation rather than an ideogrammatic one. Anyway, let's move on to the description. Okay, one of the special materials necessary for a holy chalice ritual. That first line is very straightforward, so we'll just go straight on to the central section here. The giant brain that Mensis gained in the nightmare. So, right off the bat, first of all, that's like just that whole first line is just identifying a subject, right? We're about to modify it with like is. But before we get that far, it's interesting to note that in that like string of modifiers, we're noting that Mensis gained the giant brain in a or the nightmare or nightmares, right? This is Japanese. I've harped on about this several times already. A little bit vague. If we associate that nightmare with the nightmare that they were led to by the Mensis cage, then they didn't have the brain of Mensis until they came to the nightmare of Mensis. Very interesting. Anyway, let's continue on with this idea, right? So the giant brain that Mensis gained in, I'm going to say the nightmare, just for convenience sake, and move on, has certainly enveloped inner eyes, right? And I say enveloped because that's a conjugated form of daku, which I've been paying some special attention to in this playthrough because we have, remember that note in Bergenworth where we have the idea of embracing a child or us children, or right, it's super vague, right? But the verb that's associated with the Great One descending is daku. And so in here we have the idea of embracing internal eyes. So this giant brain certainly has embraced internal eyes. Might be a way to think of it, right? And maybe that's significant in terms of the use of that verb here again. Maybe it's not. I feel like embracing a child and embracing internal eyes, like even though the verbs are the same in Japanese, the context is different enough that I don't think there's a strong connection between the two ideas, but there could be, potentially including one involving the Bergenworth Notes official translation concerning a womb being blessed with child. Gameplay Matt never considered this, but upon watching the episode back, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe the similar phrasing around developing a child and developing internal eyes might be meant to indicate that the verb embrace is being used as a kind of euphemism. Again, that's not a sense of the word I have any actual experience with, but I still thought it was a possibility worth sharing. So I'm just going to throw that out there and move on. However, it was a complete failure. So this seems to be maybe another idea of vacuity, right? Ram the vacuous spider. Some sort of ascension happened, and it turned out Ram was an idiot. Well, we have this giant brain in the Nightmare of Mensis, and it's got internal eyes all right, but it's a total failure. A failure in what sense? I don't really know. Could be the idea of malformed. That's because the term dekisokonai can involve the sense of the word dekiru, meaning to be made, constructed, or formed, and the sense of the term sokonao, meaning to ruin or do badly. Incidentally, I can't remember what the official translation is on this one, and I think this is an item where it's possible the Japanese got an update that the official English hasn't. I haven't gotten to this in Translation Born yet, so I don't have the strongest concept of what this is compared to the English. So I'm not really going to do a thorough comparison. Certainly that's not the point of this playthrough anyway. I'm just going to cover the basic ideas that I'm getting from the Japanese. But thoroughly malformed, right? That might be another way that we could approach this. Anyway, let's move on to the final line of this central section. That eye, or those eyes, probably those eyes, since you saw the thing, right? There's more than one eye in its brain. In its, giant mass that is itself is the brain, and it probably has eyes that we couldn't even see, right? So those eyes were a type of evil eye, and the brain itself was completely rotten. So there you go. Whether you consider it a failure or just malformed, this is the elaboration of how it's gone bad, right? The eyes are like a form of evil eye, malicious eye. I'm not sure if there's more to that idea off the top of my head, but maybe that has something to do with why it was inciting frenzy all the time, right? Because its eyes were evil. I don't know. And the brain itself, again, completely rotten. So, again, probably not capable of the higher level thoughts that Mensis was hoping for. Anyway, that's the final setup. That's the final line of the central section there. Let's move on to the very final section. However, that was still a great one and left a relic. In particular, living, I want to say ones? Could be living things, but I think it's living ones, as in living relics, are truly valuable, right? So even though this thing was a failure as far as Mensis was concerned, as far as their purposes went, right? Maybe, I haven't really thought about this before. Again, I haven't even covered this in Translation Born yet, but maybe there's this idea of making use of the failures, right? So if we want to parallel with the choir, I was just talking about how they tried to make contact with the outer reaches of the cosmos with the call beyond, and they failed, but they were able to use a side effect, and they were able to create that burst of stars that forms the attack that you can use with the call beyond. Maybe Mensis had a similar idea. They got this brain that they thought they wanted that was lined with eyes, that was a great one, when they gained access to the nightmare, and then it turned out to be a failure because it wasn't what they wanted. The eyes were evil eyes that maybe had a property that inspired frenzy, and the brain itself was rotted through, whatever that means. But it was still useful for them, right? They could use those evil eyes to their benefit, right? They could keep people from making any sort of progress through the nightmare of Mensis, right? They could use it as another obstacle if anyone did try and come and stop them. So, it didn't stop us, but again, we're the hunter of the dream. That's what happens. Anyway, it's interesting to note that we get another confirmation. It's a great one, right? There are people who talk about Bloodborne's lore who want to be very, selective about what they consider a great one. And it's interesting that this is the game in and of itself saying, you might not think much of this great one. Mensis certainly didn't, but it is one, right? What is the qualification of being a great one? It's just some sort of existence on another level than humanity, right? So even though the brain of Mensis wasn't particularly impressive, it was still a legitimate great one. And as a result, it's left behind this relic. And it's a living relic. It's a living string, which makes it particularly valuable, particularly potent, I suppose, right? So, and again, this is what you need if you want to make the final story chalice, which is, again, crucial if you want to understand the story where Queen Yarnum comes from. So this is a key item in the chalice explorations that link up most strongly with the ultimate story of Bloodborne. But that's more than I want to get into now. I've certainly talked for long enough about, random aspects of the lore. I'm going to head back to the Hunter's Dream. We're going to check out what Blitzcott told me about, and then probably bring the episode to a close. I'll see you again soon. Okay, here we are back in the Hunter's Dream. And I want to see if this is still visible. Okay, I want to see the best way to look at it, too. Okay, here we go. So, apparently, Blitzcott let me know that in the doors of the workshop in the Hunter's Dream, there are images of these things that look like Margot's attendants. Like, in the door textures. And I think we've seen some there. Yep, and there they are again on the other side. So that would seem to verify that. Let's look on the outside. Yep, same exact figures. And I don't have it, like, I don't have a great visual memory, so I'm not necessarily the best person to be doing this. I can put up in editing a comparison. Maybe I've already done that. I don't know. I'm probably doing it still now. But there could be a resemblance there. And Blitzcott was saying there might be. They weren't in a position to check the abandoned old workshop to see if they're still there. I'm just checking these other doors while I'm here. Yes, so these other doors also have this image of this strange sort of masked figure emblazoned on them. And so, since I do have the chance, I'm going to head to the abandoned old workshop. I think it's one of the hidden ones, right? Yeah, here we go. I'm going to head to the abandoned old workshop, and we're going to double check to see if the same images are also there. All right, we're back in the abandoned old workshop, and let's just take a peek at these doors here. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed, that is that same figure here on the abandoned old workshop door, set of doors. We have it on the outside, we have it on the inside. We have it on the outside here as well. Yes. Is it also on this set of doors over here? I'm thinking, yeah, it looks like it is. So whatever this carving is, if you want to consider that, if I can find one, there we go. If you want to consider that as similar in appearance to Margot's attendants, that could be of some significance. Now, I think it would actually be more interesting if these carvings weren't here in the abandoned old workshop in the real world, because that would imply then that in something related to the formation of the Hunter's Workshop in the dream, uniquely, there would be these figures that are sort of similar to the Margot's attendant enemies that we only see in the Nightmare of Mensis. We don't really get any sort of anticipation of them in the real world. So, perhaps, in that case, we could say that these are beings that, exist largely in dreams and are tied to some sort of care of an infant that's treated as special. Because the third umbilical cord in this place and the creation of the Hunter's Dream itself seems to have been tied up with a third cord, which of course is associated with an infant Great One. So, maybe, I don't know, but again, that's not the case, right? So, we do have this carving here in quote-unquote reality, and maybe this is evidence that you could say this workshop here, too, is part of a dream, if you really want to make that theory work. Or you could have another theory. Anyway, I've checked on the visual information, so I'm going to head back to the Hunter's Dream, I'm going to level up, and I'm going to say my farewells. And Gameplay Matt forgot to say this, but thanks again to Blitzcott for bringing that up. Visual information, parsing, that sort of thing is not my forte, but if you have a more interesting way of making sense of that and tying it in with other visuals from the game, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Anyway, right, I was going to level up.
Welcome home. What is... Very well.
Just dump another point into Arcane, because why not? Not really a lot of point in it, but I've got the Blood Echoes, so I will. And might as well heal up a bit here. Heal up a bit. I talk about it like it's me. It's my weapons. There we go. And let's see, what can I buy a bunch of at the shop? 83 and 96, I'm not going to buy those. It's kind of annoying to get the, whatever resource is full message, so I'm just going to leave those the way they are for now. Sedatives, I could use some sedatives. I've got a bunch in storage, but, might as well spend some blood echoes while I have them to buy more. And then maybe from here, yeah, I'll just max out the blood vials I can buy, because 87 is still far enough away from 99 that I feel pretty comfortable about that. All right, so that's brought us to the end of another episode. Thank you all very much for joining me. I hope you had fun. This one probably wasn't as exciting as the last one, but there was a bunch of, lore. We get to talk about some mechanical stuff. We got a good mix, really, I think. If you don't think so, I'm sorry. If you have any other thoughts, if there's anything you think that I missed, if you think I got anything wrong, as always, I would love to hear from you. If you have any further theories, it's been very fun sharing this playthrough, this whole celebration of 10 years of Bloodborne with you. We're getting pretty close to the end here. I'm going to see what I can do about Chalice Dungeons off camera. I'm not optimistic right now, but I've been unoptimistic in the past and things have worked out. So we'll just have to see how things go. I'm still not going to promise Queen Yarnum by the end of the playthrough because we're very close. Anyway, I've rambled on about that long enough. I'm going to call an end to my hunt for the evening. But as always, I wish all of you good hunting. Yeah, we're back to the standard operating procedure here. Let's do make contact. Good hunting, everyone.